Welcome back to part 2 of our video series about product lifecycle assessments. You may recall that part 1 was an overview of the LCA process as defined by ISO standards 14040 and 14044, while part 2 has been a deep dive into the phases that constitute the assessment at an executive level. We began by defining the goal and scope of the study, followed by an inventory of all of the processes, flows, and other parameters of interest within our model. Most recently, we translated these myriad data into tangible environmental mechanisms by analyzing their impact using the LCIA phase. This time, we explore what is arguably the final executive phase of the LCA, the lifecycle interpretation phase. In this phase, the results we've collected across the study are summarized and considered as a basis for conclusions, recommendations, and decision-making with respect to the goal and scope. The discussion that arises from these considerations is accurately called the interpretation of the LCA results. Depending on the needs of your organization, this is the point at which you start getting some answers to questions you might have wanted to explore, or perhaps where you will start getting the outputs as a function of some inputs and can begin to digest the results. So, what are the defining characteristics of this phase? At this point, we've run our flows through our product systems and we've received results from the impact assessment phase in the form of an LCIA profile. We can now undergo the lifecycle interpretation phase and use a systematic procedure to evaluate and present our conclusions with respect to our goal and scope. Basically, we're going to take the findings of the LCI phase and consider them together with the LCIA profile, if we have one. By the end of this phase, we should be able to reach conclusions, explain our limitations, and provide recommendations about how to move forward. A somewhat useful way of understanding what the interpretation phase is to list out a couple of things that it is not. To begin doing that, we would do well to remember something at this point, that our LCIA results were based on a relative approach derived from reference parameters. This means that any conclusions we draw about environmental effects should be viewed in terms of their potential rather than as an absolute metric. Once we recognize this, we should understand that the interpretation phase cannot be used to directly predict actual risks or impacts. Rather, our findings may take the form of conclusions or recommendations for decision makers, all within the context of the goal and scope. Indeed, the interpretation phase is not designed to produce a list of answers, or even an algorithm that we can just apply and solve all of the problems within our product system. Rather, it's intended to provide a presentation of our results within the goal and scope that is complete and consistent and easy to understand. Now, let's make a few observations before we dive into the technical details of the lifecycle interpretation phase. The procedure we use during interpretation is iterative, like much of the LCA. Because of this, the phase might involve revising one or more steps in any of the phases we've explored so far, even as far back as the scope. Although, at this late stage of the game, you should hold the goal constant, otherwise you just risk completely redoing the study. You may also come to realize that we have indeed been performing interpretation steps already, throughout the study up to this point. Every time we made a value choice, every time we classified data or operated on it, we were using our best judgment to understand how the data is generated, why it will be useful, and how we will harness that usefulness in the end. All of these informal interpretation steps are incorporated in this formal phase of the study. Here's a tip if you've been using external environmental management techniques alongside the LCA. Try using the interpretation phase to emphasize the strengths and limits of the LCA with respect to your goal and scope. This will help provide the linkups you'll need to bring in these other techniques when you consolidate your final report. Finally, remember that no two LCAs are alike. Some LCA applications may not appear to immediately address improvements in your process or product. Example LCAs include those used for education, or those that are strictly for information about a given product lifecycle, for example. However, as ISO points out, as soon as you apply this kind of information in practice, it is, by definition, being used in the context of improvement. It's sort of a tautology, you can't quite escape it. Therefore, you should take special care and ensure that the information you do generate is applicable to the context in which it will be used. This is good advice for the entire study, but it's especially relevant from this point forward as we get into data reporting. Alright, very good. Let's begin a deeper study of our interpretation phase by looking at the elements that make it up. For context, let's see how the interpretation phase fits into the study overall. Notice that the two bookending phases frame the study. These are the goal and scope definition and interpretation phases. Meanwhile, the other phases of our LCA, namely the inventory and impact assessment phases, produce information on the product system. Together, they make up the complete LCA framework. During interpretation, we access our results from the previous phases and, depending on the element, leverage various data to make our determinations. These elements are as follows. Identification of the significant issues. This is based squarely on the results of both the LCI and LCIA phases, and should reflect considerations that were founded in the goal and scope definition phase before being carried through to the rest of the study. The second element is one of evaluation. This element contains formal operations called checks, designed to probe the validity of your study as well as the associated documentation, which I know you've been tracking meticulously, right? There are three classes of checks in the evaluation element rather. Completeness, which ensures that we've collected and utilized all of the data that we need to achieve our goal. Sensitivity, which assesses significant inputs and outputs to understand any uncertainties in the results. Finally, consistency, which helps confirm that our assumptions, methods, and data comport with the goal and scope as we have defined them. The third interpretation phase element is in fact a collection consisting of conclusions, limitations, and recommendations. In relation to the goal, the interpretation looks at how appropriate our definitions were for things like our functional unit and our system boundary. The interpretation also identifies any limitations introduced by the data quality assessment and our sensitivity analysis. This third element is the place where all of these final considerations get wrapped up together and receive justification at a very high level of analysis. So, just a final note before we dive in. ISO provides extensive examples pertaining to lifecycle interpretation in Annex B of the 14044 standards document. This can provide a lot of help at this stage, especially if you have trouble identifying significant issues or evaluating certain parts of your study. We will now explore these elements in detail, but it's worthwhile to know that these examples exist, just in case we don't quite connect here today. Okay then. Let's look at the first element of the interpretation phase, identification of significant issues. The objective of this element is to build some structure into the results that we obtain from the LCI and LCIA phases. We do this to help determine the significant issues that fall into the purview of our goal and scope definition. We should try to include all of the implications of any methods that we used over the course of the study. This can include any assumptions that we made or allocation rules that we set, our cutoff decisions when it came to our criteria for inclusion, and the selections that we made in the LCIA of our impact categories, category indicators, and characterization models. So fine, this is all well and good, but what are some examples of significant issues that we should consider? How do you decide what is important, what's relevant? Well, that depends on the goal of your study, right? It depends what's important to you, what's on your radar, so to speak. But let's define a starting point. Here's a 3-point list to get you started on the right path. First, look at your inventory data for things like energy flows, emissions, discharges, and waste. This is data you can collect from the LCI phase. Second, look at your impact categories for things like resource use, human health, and climate change. This is data you can collect from the LCIA phase. And thirdly, look at contributions from across lifecycle stages that significantly impact your LCI or LCIA results. This might be an individual unit process, or perhaps a group or groups of processes that play a large role or command a lot of resources or costs within your product system. Typical examples for things like this are transportation or energy production. Now, this is a good starting point for identifying your significant issues. The question still remains, though, what sort of information should you focus on in order to best carry out this identification process? ISO suggests 4 types of information that you should emphasize when you're executing this element. First, gather your results from the LCI and LCIA phases. Assemble them together and arrange them into some sort of data structure that makes sense for your study, alongside any information that you have about their data quality. Second, detail the methodological choices you made over the course of the study. Major players here include things like your allocation rules, a formal definition of your system boundary from the perspective of your LCI, and the category indicators and characterization models that you used in your LCIA. Thirdly, identify the value choices used in the study, as defined in the goal and scope. Note that this does not necessarily mean that you need an exhaustive list of every single value choice that you made, but rather, try to describe at least an outline of the mindset undertaken by your organization at the outset of the study. This will help affirm and contextualize the goal within the confines of the scope. And finally, list the roles and responsibilities of any interested parties associated with the LCA. Remember that as far as application potential of your LCA, we first listed the interested parties and their intentions back in the goal and scope definition phase. You should also include the results from a concurrent critical review process if you decide to conduct one. We'll talk more about the critical review phase in our next video. Now, once you've gathered up all of these results and you've determined that they meet the demands of your goal and scope, you can start to determine their significance. And once again, the significance of the various issues will be reflected by the goal and scope of your study. What I mean by that is this. You may discover results that underline legitimate concerns, environmentally or otherwise. Ultimately, however, it's up to you and your organization to delineate the significance of each of these results as they pertain to the study. You need to make a determination about what is relevant to the study and what is not. You can certainly keep notes about extraneous issues that might pop up and maybe you can deal with them later, but at this point it is important that you respect the scope of the study. Now, once you've identified those significant issues, you may want to consolidate those results for further analysis after the study is over, and that's fine. Be sure to save all your information on the data quality if that's what you decide to do. But you will know when you've finished identifying the significant issues better than anybody else will. This is because the goal, and more precisely the endpoint of the study, is dictated primarily by your needs. I'll just mention this again. If you're unsure about this element of identification of significant issues, maybe you'd just like to see some specific approaches, just recall that there's a variety of examples available in Annex B of the ISO 14044 document, including application of different methods and tools. All right. Now let's look at the second element of the interpretation phase, evaluation. Our objectives here are simple. We want to take the results of our LCI and LCIA phases and establish some confidence in them, or if we already have some measure of confidence, we want to increase it. The cool thing is we can help ourselves do that by including the significant issues that we just identified in the first interpretation element. Our results for this element in particular should be presented in a manner that gives a clear and understandable view of the outcome of the study for anyone that might read it. This is because it is the element in this phase that most lay people would likely consider closest to the answer, as it were, of the study. So it needs to be very clear. The evaluation procedure itself should be reflective of the goal and scope, of course. When you actually go to carry it out, ISO recommends considering the following 3 techniques: a completeness check, a sensitivity check, and a consistency check. We'll look at these one by one, but let me begin by saying that you should not complete these checks in a vacuum. For example, you should try to have the results of the uncertainty analysis and data quality analysis on hand from your LCIA. You're going to want to use these analyses to supplement these 3 checks. I'll also take this opportunity to remind you once again that there's a variety of examples provided by ISO for working through the evaluation element. You can find them in Annex B of ISO Standard Document 14044. Alright, the first check is completeness. Our job here is relatively simple. We need to ensure that all of the relevant information and data that we need for the interpretation phase are available and complete. If we find anything is missing, we look at that info and consider whether it is actually necessary for satisfying the goal and scope of the LCA. This consideration should be justified and the whole process recorded, but I bet you already knew that. Now here's the important part though. If any relevant information is indeed missing or incomplete, and it has been considered necessary for determining the significant issues, we then need to make a choice. Either we revisit the LCI and LCIA phases and try to supplement the deficiency, or else we adjust the goal and scope definition to more accurately reflect the data we do have. Whether or not the missing info is considered necessary, record everything you decide and the reasons behind it. Our second check is for sensitivity, which is a process we should be used to by now. Let's start with a bit of a review. Our goal here is to assess the reliability of the final results and the conclusions that we draw from them. We do this by determining how they may have been affected by uncertainties in the data, or by our allocation methods, or the ways in which we calculated our category indicator results, and so on. This sub-element is sort of a nexus for sensitivity analyses performed in the study. You should gather the results of any and all sensitivity analyses or uncertainty analyses performed anywhere else in the study and include them here. This mostly concerns your LCI and LCIA phases. These 2 phases also dictate the level of detail required for your sensitivity check. Considerations should be given to the results of these phases in the context of the issues predetermined by your goal and scope. These considerations should then be supplemented by expert judgments or previous experience. Okay, so let's talk about the results of the sensitivity check for just a second here. The check should produce an output that represents some metric. This metric will aid you in determining the need for a more extensive or perhaps more precise set of sensitivity analyses within your study. It should also show apparent effects on the study results themselves via some sort of causality. Now, you may find that the sensitivity check is unable to find significant differences between, for example, methods you used or different alternatives you considered. Now, this is important. You cannot use these types of check results to conclude that such differences do not in fact exist. That's an easy trap of reasoning to fall into, and it's important to highlight in this instance. That is to say, the results of the study may very well in fact be the lack of significant differences. We just mentioned causality not too long ago, right? And it's critical to point out that this refers to the effects of your choices on the results of the study, not the validity of some choices with respect to others. I really hope that's clear. Okay, our third check in the evaluation element is for consistency. The objective here is to determine whether our data and our assumptions and any of the methods we used are consistent with the goal and scope. This kind of mirrors the completeness check, but now we're looking more at the framework rather than the flows. And just like the completeness check, this is a fairly straightforward check to perform. Essentially, you're going to want to ask yourself a series of questions as they relate to your study. If the questions aren't relevant, feel free to discard them. If they are relevant, spend some time verifying the avenues explored here. The first question to address is, are the differences in data quality along the product system lifecycle and between different product systems consistent within the goal and the scope? What about allocation rules and the system boundary? Have they been consistently applied to all of the product systems? Have the elements of the LCIA been consistently applied wherever their consideration is relevant? And finally, What about any regional or temporal differences? Do they exist in your product systems? And if so, have they been consistently applied? Alright, that wraps up the evaluation element. Now let's explore the third element of our interpretation phase. This is where we draw conclusions, identify limitations, and make recommendations for the intended audience of the LCA. All of these will of course depend on the goal of your study within the context of the scope, but let's drill down just a little bit. Conclusions should be drawn from the study in an iterative fashion alongside the other elements in the interpretation phase. A logical sequence for the process might look like this. First, identify your significant issues. Then you can evaluate the methodology and the results of your three checks: completeness, sensitivity, and consistency. Then you can draw some preliminary conclusions and check that these are consistent with the requirements of your goal and scope. If these conclusions are consistent, you can report them as full conclusions. Otherwise, you're going to want to iterate back to the previous steps as appropriate. Your recommendations, on the other hand, should be based on the final conclusions of the study. They should reflect a logical and reasonable consequence of those conclusions. And also remember that we should shape them so that they relate to the intended application of the LCA, something we mentioned at the beginning of the video. Wherever it's appropriate to the goal and scope, you should also list and explain some specific recommendations for the decision makers that are involved in the study, whether they read it or whether they help perform it. So that's the video for the life cycle interpretation phase. We're just about ready to wrap up our video series here on product LCAs. In our final video, we will look at both the reporting and critical review phases. This is the point at which we finalize our results and present our findings to our target audience, as well as review the study to analyze our strengths and weaknesses and find out what we can bring to the table the next time we perform an LCA on this product system or any other product system. It's the culmination of our many hours of discussion, and I can't wait to see you there to celebrate the end of our journey together. I'm Jamie Freno-Cumbo with EnviroPass. Thanks for watching.